Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the first workshop and becoming part of the first cohort of the Step Up program towards policy action in Mumbai. I am Gurpriya. I am from Ministry of Mumbai's Magic team. Along with me, we have Arpita, Tanisha, and Akbar, as well as our collaborators Andre, Karan, and Akash from Global Shapers Community Mumbai, and Abhas joining us from Young People's Action Team from the Yuva Network. So we will be the facilitators for today's workshop. Arpita will be the lead facilitator, and all of us will be co-facilitating the sessions today. First off, I would encourage you all, if your internet allows, to switch on your video so we all can see each other and interact through the video feature as well. We have virtual backgrounds. We'll take you through it in a minute. But really glad to have you all here. We had over 100 registrations. So we are having 3 cohorts for the Stepper program, and you're part of the first cohort. The Stepper program is really an opportunity for Mumbai's youth to contribute towards making Mumbai a livable city through individual actions that we can take. And this is really first step towards building our understanding and knowledge on what kind of actions we can take on climate, what kind of policy actions we can enable through our individual actions as well. Um, Tanisha, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. Just a few house rules. We would really encourage you all to be as participative as possible. It was really on a voluntary basis that all of you had signed up for the workshop. So we would request you all to switch off all external emails and WhatsApps and things like that and focus on the workshop today. We will have folks who come from different backgrounds. So we would encourage you all to be respectful and make space for others. Please do contribute, but also we invite you to listen to others actively as well. We will, the workshop is structured in a way where we will have 1 hour of session delivery and 1 hour of interactive sessions. So really, we hope that this cohort keeps engaging with each other and makes the most out of the 1 hour interaction that you all will have. Um, and also, yeah, so I think that's broadly it. If there are any tech issues that you face, if there is any other kind of activity that makes you uncomfortable, please do flag it to us so we can take note of that. Now, I think moving on, I'm really glad to see that cameras are being switched on. This is really exciting. Folks, if you can do make use of the virtual backgrounds. This is to ensure your safety as well. I think Arpita was mentioning a few minutes ago that there have been cases where through the backgrounds, locations have been identified of people. So we encourage you to use virtual backgrounds. I'm going to pop the link on the chat again. Maybe I'll just give it a minute for folks to try out virtual backgrounds. Awesome. I think Shanae has been able to do it. Rashmi, Shivangi, Nikita have also tried it out. It's okay if your systems don't allow you to do that. If you can, we encourage you to do so. Um, Lastly, I would just like to mention that we would urge you all to keep yourself on mute. If you have questions, please do put it on the chat or raise your hand. The facilitators will call on you and request you to unmute. This is just to ensure that there is not too much disturbance in the room. So please do use the chat function as much as possible. Drop in your comments, questions there, as well as raise hands as and when facilitators ask you to do. So for us to begin with, we can start with a round of introduction. Since we have a large room, we will use the chat box to do so. Please post your name, put your pronouns next to your names, rename yourself on Zoom, and also put in your soul animal in the chat box. What animal do you most relate to? What is your soul animal? Um, Please do pop those on the chat so we can know more about you. Folks, this shouldn't take you long at all. Uh, Hope you all have had your Saturday morning coffees. So do pop in your soul animal in the chat in the next 1 minute.
The animal question always reminds me that one of my teachers called me a cow when I was in ninth standard, just because of how stupid and naive I was. So Abha's totally with you on that. We have both water animals and land animals, and nobody is like a bird so far, which is interesting.
I did mention a bird.
Excellent. So we have covered the entire range.
This is really amazing. Folks, I also encourage you all to put in your pronouns um, next to your names, either on chat or rename yourself on Zoom. Um, wow, we have such a great diversity here. Amazing. I still think that a few haven't popped up. Um, Folks, I'm not going to put you on the spot and call your names. Please do that in the next 1 minute.
Sorry, it's a difficult question.
Have all the participants popped in their soul animals?
Wolf is an interesting one, like to be able to publicly say that they feel like a wolf is interesting. I'm very curious why. Okay, so we are 2 minutes over time. Priya.
Thanks. Yeah, just want to say that again, welcome everyone. Let's try and remember each other's soul animal. We can do a quiz at the end that how well do we know each other and see if we remember each other's soul animals. So again, welcome to the workshop. Use the chat function as much as possible to put in your comments. How are you feeling? And now I'll hand it over to Arpita to get us started for the session.
Okay, let's move into the next slide. First of all, we want to clearly set the precedent that this course is not going to get you a certification because it's not an accredited course. It is meant to provide you with the key concepts of policy making, especially in the climate space, with some examples, with introduction to experts, with those conversations. It will enable you to participate in a lot of the civic participation that you can do around climate. but it will not provide you any employable skills unless you decide to pick on that interest and take it forward in a more rigorous and course in the future. It will not make you a policy analyst, because we are expecting folks to spend about 10 hours with us, 2 hours of workshop 1, 2 hours of workshop 2, if you'd like to go into the second workshop. And the rest of the hours would be essentially to give you some post-workshop reading, some more conversations that we'll probably get you onboarded for. And that's literally it. Let's go into the first section now. So today we are going to cover these topics on your screen. Basically, the idea for us today is to give you a foundation of what climate governance looks like, what kind of elements it has, who are the stakeholders, who are the actors, what kind of roles do they play, get you to understand the difference between national, subnational, and regional actors. And then we'll go into a very interesting section, which will talk about the different instruments for policy change in climate, that will introduce you to the idea of how market failures essentially cause environmental externalities, how governments try to correct it through policy interventions. Think about some of the examples that India has already tested. And in the last section, we will spend some time together to look at some of the policies that have been introduced, understand what they are trying to do based on your learning, and just huddle up and share back. So the first 1 hour, first half of this exercise today, of which I think we've lost 15 to 17 minutes already, we will be spending just listening and trying to absorb as much as possible. I would pause and invite questions, but do remember that we are not, any of us are not experts. We are all enablers in this ecosystem. We are advocates on policy change as campaigners, as organizers. But if there are questions that we are not able to address, we'll definitely connect you back to the people who can. At the end of this exercise, you will also be introduced to the next steps, where there is a feedback form, there are mechanisms for you to engage with the facilitators here, as well as understand what is coming your way in the next workshop, because that's a very exciting element. Okay, let's get in to the first section. So the first section here is on climate governance. So you can imagine that building climate solutions is fairly complex. It works at a different scale, different levels and different scales, from global to national to subnational and local. And it involves, and it must involve all of these different actors who are participants in the society. So climate change governance is essentially linked to how countries are developing, how they're prioritizing action, how they're thinking about the well-being of their people, as well as its as well as nature. So before we get in, I wanted to throw this video onto you, which has very interesting perspectives. So there are 3 speakers here who will be talking about what is it that governments can really do on climate action. Tanisha, can you play? Yeah. And let us know if you can't hear them. Tanisha, you'll have to unmute yourself, sorry.
Can you guys hear now?
These structural decisions, and climate change is a structural issue. It's like, where do you do your planning? Where you build these things? What do you give permits to? How do you organize your society such that people are nudged into doing things, the right things for the climate, versus doing things that are destructive to the climate, right? Governments have an enormous and subtle role to play in guiding choices that society makes. They're not very successful sometimes when they try and pick winners, or when they try and say, let's do it this way, but they are quite successful at shifting cultures such that, you know, better decisions in the end get made. And that's really where they need to be focusing.
The governments should do what they say they're going to do about climate change. They should not keep saying that they're going to do something and then do nothing at all. So they should abide by their own rules, their own guidance, their own words, their own policies, but they're not doing that at the moment. So governments need to be actually moving away from the rhetoric of climate change, just writing about it in government reports, and delivering actually meaningful action. And virtually no governments around the world are doing that at the moment. They've been writing the right sort of reports for 10 or more years about the policy documents, but they've delivered nothing in terms of reducing emissions. So it is just really translating the policies into meaningful action. And that will require them to be much braver, have more courage, stand up to the lobby groups, particularly those from the vested interests in the industry, whether it's the fossil fuel industry, the car industry, and so forth. So they have to be much more courageous, show real leadership. And remember, they are appointed not by the oil companies or by the car companies. They are put in place generally by the population. So it's important that they remember that it is to us that they ultimately have to answer to.
The government has to affect the structure of our societies. One of my previous answers, I mentioned mass transit, being able to take buses and trains and so forth. They're much more energy efficient than a personal automobile is, no matter whether it's an electric automobile or not. Mass transit will always win because you move more people for the same amount of capital and the same amount of energy resources. And only governments can do that. I can't choose to have a bus magically appear. And that's the kind of thing that government has to step up to do. It has to make the choices of whether to subsidize personal automobiles or whether to subsidize mass transit. Government has to decide how electricity gets generated. You know, I can't, well, now that I have solar panels, I kind of do have my own power plant, but that required regulatory changes in California because for a very long time, you could not get them. The utilities would not allow you to connect solar panels. All those things required legislative changes and then changes to the regulatory structure that governs utilities and so on. Government has to do those things. We can't do them as individuals.
Reduce subsidies to fossil fuels, redirect those, there's over $1 billion of subsidies that go to fossil fuel energy investments every year. You take that investment and you dedicate it to environmental services, dedicated to the protecting the food systems, dedicated to renewable energy sources, and I think that would have a huge impact.
All right, lots to absorb from this video. I would like to hear which element, what comment, what idea did you all pick on? What is that one or two words that that you were? Can we stay to the previous slide, please? What are the ideas that you picked on? What is that one thing that you really resonated with that the governments need to do? And any key highlights that anybody would like to share? You can also put on the chat window any quick reflections here. Otherwise, I'm just going to call out names. Nikita, I see Nikita on my screen. Change culture, yes. Good mass transit, I think, and that's a conversation that we as Mumbaikars are constantly trying to have in the public domain. Reduce subsidies, but what are we reducing subsidies for? Reducing energy in a sustainable way, yes. Fossil fuel subsidy, regulatory changes. What does regulation mean here, Tanmay? Being mindful of nexus and lobbies. Okay, I didn't notice that. Importance of public transport. The key idea, if you notice here, and the why of introducing this video in the very beginning, is to start to shift away from the idea of what we do as individuals versus what we can do collectively and what governments can do, especially as people that have been elected into power by the public, especially as bodies who can exercise coercion, can make laws, and can implement them. The other idea that the second speaker was talking about, that even when governments are committing to doing something, they must be held accountable. And citizens can play an important role here by asking the right question, participating in the policy-making process. A lot of these processes we'll talk about and get introduced in the next workshops as well, and being active. So while governments have been creating policies, and some of the most amazing policies exist in our country, how are we able to analyze those policies just based on what the policies is aiming to do, And how do we go about implementing them is the key challenge for us as people who have put those governments in power. Great. So let's move on to the next exercise, which is a little bit of a reflection again. And here we just want to hear from all of you. If you can pick on one of these words, what does it mean to you? What do you think is the government for you? Are they a caregiver? Are they a guardian? Are they a head of a state? Global players, a class monitor? We just want to have some quick reflections. Just pick on a word that just resonates with the idea of government for you. Public agent, public representative, decision maker, change maker. So nobody's seeing governments as a boss. That's interesting given the state of affairs in this country. Abhas, I also want to hear your response. Decision maker, change maker. What about superpower? Do you think governments are people with superpowers? Are they like your hero? Are they a father figure, communicators, head of a family? And all these ideas are very subjective, but we all have very intuitive response to it that's based on how we associate ourselves in relation to the governments. Okay, Avanti says putting governments on a pedestal is dangerous. Avanti, would you like to unmute and talk about it for a minute, please?
So I feel like one of the important things, I mean, at least from what I understood, and I'm just trying to think about, I think I agree that there's a lot of responsibility that falls on governments as well in general. However, I also think that its decisions are collective and they sort of are a product of different stakeholders being involved. And I think it's important to understand the government is just as much a player in that decision making. And yes, while they do have a lot more responsibility, they're also answerable and they're also just as important in decision making as companies, individuals, lobbyists, public policy makers, etc.
All right, heard and heard. So in the next few slides, we will start to unpack it a little bit and see where we land after that. So none of you is actually necessarily wrong or necessarily right either, because there is no absolute right or wrong. When we think about the technical definition of what a government is essentially the governing body. Let's stay on the previous slide, please. It's essentially the governing body of a state and the system by which a state or a community is governed. It's a political institution. And a state or nation, when we think about it, is a political community that is within a territory. And how do we, one should be able to differentiate that with the idea of a nation, which is an idea, which is an ideology. So you don't necessarily need to be a citizen of India to feel the sense of nationalistic pride. You could be born in a different country, raised in a different country, and still have that nationalistic emotions to your community. But when we talk about country or when we talk about a state, that is defined by the territory and the people that live within that territory. So a state or nation state eventually is a community that occupies a territory. It has an organized government, and the government holds the authority to make and enforce laws. And but for them to enforce those laws, they don't necessarily need consent of a higher authority, which is why they are often understood as the people at the with the highest amount of power. So before we go ahead, I also want to unpack the idea. Can we please stay on the previous slide? Unpack the idea of public agent, because I know a lot of you sort of picked on that piece, and a lot of you also said public representative or public speaker or somebody who acts on behalf of the public, which is a very important element of how we understand government. A government is not an individual. It is not a private firm. It is not a corporation that has a defined set of stakeholders, has a defined set of objectives, and a defined way of doing its business, right? So each government will come in and have its own ways of working and figuring out what their priorities need to be based on their key constituencies. But these kind of mental models that we apply of having objectives, having something to do, and sort of meeting some end goals are not necessarily those that apply to the government. The government is, on its part, an agent of the citizens. And as agent of the citizens, the government is, the citizens are its principals. In effect, meaning that you and I vote for them to come into power so that they can make the decisions on our behalf, right? So citizens are the principals and government is the agent who works for them. However, even as citizens, especially in a country like ours, there is no homogeneity, right? Like everybody is different. There is a lot of diversity. There is a lot of differing opinions. There is a lot of differing a priority. Climate, for those of us in the room today, for example, climate action or reducing the emissions that this country is creating is a priority for all of us, right? But when we look at the broader picture, when we go outside of this cohort, we know that in India, diversity along every possible basis leaves it very difficult for citizens to form demands which are cohesive. So you have people in the left, you have people in the right, you have people in the center. Some people don't agree to fall on any of those spectrums. And this creates the problem of allowing government as the agent to have more space to do what they would like, their self-interest would like them to pursue, and restricts their space to do other things. So while you and I might think that climate is a priority that must have urgent attention, it might not be the case for the rest of the citizens in the same country. And what a government takes up at any given point of time, it does not necessarily square with what you think or I think or somebody else thinks is important. So an important way that government shapes agenda is also understanding where the political narrative, where the public sentiment fall in this spectrum. And this is what leads to the principal agent dilemma, where decisions that governments take sometimes compromises with what we would like them to do. And now looking at multi-climate governance, over here in front of you, without diving into too many of these elements, we know that climate change is a global problem. Then we know that action therefore needs to be happening at international and the national border and within the nation as well. It is an issue that requires international cooperation to happen. It requires coordination between various bodies that you see in front of you. And multi-level climate governance is therefore continuous process of discussions. You have diverse group of governments, players, international organizations, private sector, NGO, other social actors coming together, engaging with each other, maybe through a formal process of debate and discourse in a public forum, maybe through backdoor lobbying and conversations or planning or sort of prioritizing and things like that. But what this sort of framework enables us to do is to ensure that each of this actor has a certain role, each of the actor has a certain impetus that they are all able to exercise on each other to put pressure on the, for decisions to be made fairly quickly. And this is regardless of anybody having a certain amount of authority to play. So what we often see as example is the Paris Agreement, which I'm sure is in the discourse that you all would be aware of, that was signed at the COP21 event. And the Paris Agreement laid down some long-term goals that would act as a guide to all the nations. It has told the nations that you have to make all efforts to limit the increase of annual global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. So every 5 years, each country will submit an updated national climate action plan, which we also know as NDCs, that is nationally determined contributions. And don't worry, we can all share these notes with you all after the workshop as well. And as part of this NDC's contribution, countries commit to certain things. And in India, we have set a target of 175 gigawatts by 2022. As of a report last week, we have achieved 100 gigawatts of that commitment. So with that, I think we can move into the next section. So many decision-making processes that happen for a country like India to prioritize climate action actually happen at a national, subnational level. That means within the country's own territory. And this will happen through creation of programs, public policies for which we are here, certain regulations. And let's just look at this slide here. And what we have done is try to map each of those stakeholders here. So I'm going to pause for a minute and would like any of those, any reflections, any disagreements to how this has been organized, any additional actors that you think have been missed. You can leave your comment in the chat section. Gurpriya has an oversight there, or you could literally just unmute and speak. And here you will see CSOs, government groups, community organizations, different departments of governments taking action. So at the national level, you have MOEFCC, which is the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change. At a subnational level, you see the state government, and you will see Maharashtra Environment Ministry and Climate Change coming in. And just to remind you that for the purview of this workshop, this is Ministry of Mumbai's magic. So all of our context remains Maharashtra and Mumbai. And as we go ahead, we will start to narrow down and take a funneled approach to think more and more about Mumbai. And we are coming to that. High Court and NGDs is missing. It's a very good point. Karan has a question for you, Anushri. Any other ideas? Yes, they are not. Anyone else? We also have other people, Kaustav, Priyanka, Rashmi, Shanai, Swarangi. I hope Swarangi, you're back with us.
Yes, I'm here.
Any reflections on these stakeholders? And where do you all see yourself fitting into this? Central government, of course, is reflected through MOEFCC. MNCs are multinational corporations. Universities can fit into both the national and subnational scales. I am just surprised nobody caught on that. Absolutely. Okay, seems like nobody has any more thoughts, so we can move on. Okay, so now we are going into another very important section, and this is where I would like you to really pay attention, because based on what you learn in this section, the key concepts, you will have to apply them in going into the activities in the second half of this workshop. So let's just recap for all of us. Policy and public policy are not the same thing. They are very broad terms. Policy is basically a set of rules and guidelines for action, right? So you could also have policies that you use, for example, workplace policies, right? Which are policies which are applied to a certain defined set of people, and they do not are applied across the board for the public. But we look at public policy, it becomes rules and guidelines which are enforced by the state. State here is your government, and government, if you recall, are the ultimate power holder of a country, at least on paper, who can enact laws and who have the ability and the right to exercise coercion in enforcing those laws. And when we think about climate policies, and this is slightly going into the scientific domain, but we feel like that just having some clarity on these two concepts is essential as we go ahead. Climate policies essentially are, oh, I see some people are still accepting the invite for this workshop. And I feel like maybe one or two of you are joining just now. So climate policies are designed to do two things. And any sort of, in fact, any action that you take on climate is going to try to do two things. One is mitigation. And I know a lot of you already know these concepts, but this is a recap for some of you who might not. One is mitigation, which basically aims at looking at the cause of the problem. That means it will, because we know global warming and climate change are caused by rising global greenhouse gas emissions. And the main one among that is carbon dioxide and methane. Mitigation will look at reducing the amount of those gas that are produced in the ecosystem, in the environment. And you do that often by improving energy efficiency, for example, in buildings, reducing the consumption of fossil fuels. Fossil fuel essentially is the main cause, the main culprit, and the human dependence on fossil fuels, or our economic dependence on fossil fuels, is basically what has created a lot of the emissions and global warming. So increasing shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy, wind, solar, biomass is an example of mitigation based strategy or that is often implemented. And the second concept is adaptation, which is a slightly more tricky concept to understand, but it's very important for us to understand as we go into thinking about policies for our city. Adaptation actually looks at the effect side. So we know that we have certain emissions which are in the ecosystem, which have harmed the planet, which is causing extreme weather events, causing different sort of loss of forests, all of those effects. But how do we, looking at that effect, how do we reduce the negative impact that the community faces? This means adapting to climate change means you take action to prepare and adjust for both the current impact of climate change as well as what could happen in the near future. And adaptation becomes therefore particularly important for preparing vulnerable communities from impacts of climate change. And this is where we need to start to think about climate justice for a little bit, because climate impact, if we look at the example of the rising heat stress, right? The rising heat stress does not impact you and I equally, right? I might have access to thermal comfort meaning here that I can have access to heaters to warm my ambient temperature to feel more comfortable, or I of course have access to air conditioner to not have to withstand that kind of heat stress. But a lot of folks in our community, in Mumbai also specifically, there have been reports in the last 1 year which tell you that between the slum communities who are often living hand by hand with the sort of urban middle class and upper middle class, the slum community often, given the kind of houses they have, given the kind of heat that they have to face, the temperature for them is often, that they experience is often 5 to 6 degrees Celsius higher. So if I'm saying Mumbai has a temperature of 32 degrees today, for the community who does not have access to the resources that I have, it often can go up to 37 degrees. And just think of it for a minute, what kind of difference that makes. And this is what there is existing inequity in the terms of how economic resources are distributed in everywhere in society. But climate tends to exacerbate or make worse this inequity. And I gave you an example of that. And what does, I'll repeat myself, what that means is that low-income communities, certain vulnerable groups, certain marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted by extreme weather, by worsening of air pollution. Indigenous community, and in Mumbai, we have the Kodis, we have the Wadlis, who are living closer to the land, who are living closer to the ecosystems, who are living closer to the sea, are among the hardest hit. They are among the first who have to bear the effects of sea level rise or the effects of global warming. And prioritizing adaptation, therefore, that supports this community to prepare for the burst that's coming. Even when we think about the impact of a drought or flood, it should take into account how these communities will be impacted. Reducing energy poverty is another example, right? So just transition. That means when you're transitioning from fossil fuel to solar or renewable energy, you need to ensure that by doing that, you're not letting go of the loss of jobs that's currently supported in the fossil fuel community or by the fossil fuel companies. And how do you then think of that longer term plan of transition that ensures that the low income communities have equal access? So with this concept, with some amount of foundation on that, let's dive into some of the policy instruments. Okay. And I know this is something that you all already know, so I'm not going to spend too much time here because you've all talked about it in different ways. Policy instrument essentially is the way that government will try to control or exercise control over citizens, institutions, businesses within a country's framework. So regulation is the first one, and regulation essentially means that the government will take away choices through command and control, where it will command, for example, polluting factories to install technologies that will reduce the amount of air pollution, the amount of dust or something else that they're creating. So setting environmental standards, setting restrictions, bans. A plastic ban is a good example of that. Are all examples of how this is done. NCAP, which is National Clean Air Program, that was, if I'm not wrong, sort of approved and went into implementation into 2018, is a clean air action plan that exists at a national level. It is a collection of regulation policies, which are then translating into implementation plan at the state and the local levels. Moving on to the next one very quickly, economic and market tools. And this is the most interesting, and this is where I'll spend a little bit more time. So when you think about economic activity, every economic activity, when you go to a store to buy a bag of chips, there is a certain cost. You'll pay 20 rupees, right? This is the private cost of that entity, of that product, which you are bearing. It is something that only you are getting into an agreement with the seller and buying that product, right? But often there is a third component to it. There is a third stakeholder that when you're buying and selling, you don't necessarily see. That third stakeholder is not necessarily aware that because of your engagement in this economic activity, there is going to be certain impact on it. This impact on the third entity is externality. So if a lot of people are buying a bag of chips, right, and throwing them or not disposing them properly, or there are not enough disposal mechanisms in the society, in the ecosystem to manage that waste, where does it go, right? And what happens is, for example, with waste, it ends up in unofficial, informal dumping sites. It will end up in landfill sites. Landfill sites, informal dump yards are often closer to the low-income communities. In your cities, you can observe that. Deonar dumping ground is a great example of this happening, and happening a lot for the last many years. So essentially, when we think of any economic activity, we should not think of only the buyer and seller. We should look at the externalities. And environment pollution, whether it's air pollution, it's water pollution, waste crisis, are all examples of negative externalities. Negative because there is a negative impact on a community who did not decide to engage in this activity. And this sort of negative impact can also be seen as the social cost, right? The cost that while you are paying a private cost of 20 rupees and the seller and the buyer, the seller is getting that cost, there is a third cost that is falling on society to figure out how it will manage that waste, to figure out how it will manage those emissions that are created because of that exchange, right? And this is just at the end where we are talking about how the waste is disposed. When you think about the entire manufacturing cycle, from gathering raw material to producing in industry and to selling it, to transporting it, there's an entire supply chain behind it, which has its own carbon footprint that this economic cost is not taking account of. But there is, markets can also create a positive externality. Your engaging in that market can also create a positive externality sometimes. And that, a great example of that is taking vaccines. So when you're taking a vaccine, you are benefiting, of course, for that private cost, there is a private benefit that you're getting. But there is also a social benefit that you taking vaccine is creating, right? But in the case of environment, it is often negative externalities. And therefore, governments devise market-based tools to sort of either incentivize the producers, the industries, to not to control their emissions, to control their pollutants, or they sort of put like a pricing, put like a regulation on them that will basically ask them to stop that kind of pollution from happening. So polluter pays charges. If you're producing X amount of goods, you have to pay X amount of money. Removal of harmful subsidies. So governments, and you go back to the initial video we all saw, governments can subsidize fossil fuel companies to lower the amount of products that they're creating, to lower their emissions, to put caps on them. Caps is a limit on anything. And the government can also subsidize those who have eco-friendly alternatives to put in more and more eco-friendly solutions into the market. And both of these sides, the carrots and sticks approach, are a good example of that. Public investment, what we were seeing in the initial video as well, governments have the power to incentivize public transport, mass transit solutions, your metros, your bus, right? But governments can also tax the car users to include like higher maybe parking charges or certain caps that will ensure that they have to pay extra, they have to they are in effect de-incentivized to use more and more private vehicles. And all of that governments tries to do through different sort of policies. It could happen at the state level, it could happen at the central level, and there are enough examples in the last 1 year within Mumbai that we can look at for this. So in a sense, what this instruments, economic and market tools try to do is address the market failure that has been created and that has caused a negative externality on the environment by incorporating the cost of production or consumption of those activities through taxes, through charges, or by creating and facilitating the establishment or the push to alternative eco-friendly markets. So one question I want to leave you with, when you think about polluter pays principle, is it the owner of a vehicle or the manufacturer who should be punished for vehicular emissions? And the second, in the case of plastics, is it the manufacturer of plastic packaging products who should be fined, or the producer or the seller of those products, the FMCGs? With that, let's go to the third tool, since we are running out of time. This is fairly simple. Information, like how do we use information and provide knowledge? And this knowledge needs to be provided to the consumers who are making the choice of between A and B product to reduce their consumption, to reduce their carbon footprint. And one of the very good examples that I can give here is the star labeling in air conditioners, the star labeling in refrigerators. Basically, through eco-labeling schemes, the star labels indicate how eco-friendly, how sustainable, how energy efficient a product is. Energy efficient would mean that it will consume less electricity, but give better outputs, right? And by doing that, what the government is trying to do is it's trying to help consumer like you and I make an informed choice about different sort of energy performance of a product, so that you understand the impact of your decisions at a day-to-day consumption level. Sustainable reporting is another example. Awareness campaigns. So Swachh Bharat could be another example where the government tried to push public to stop discarding waste on the streets, or start cleaning up, or start thinking about better hygiene, and adopting toilets and all of that. And a lot of the campaigns that the governments do is about ensuring awareness, because unless people understand what they're trying to say, unless the government also understand the kind of uptake a particular campaign has at a policy level, they often do not want to go into implementation. Right? So there is often a if you remember, in the government exercise, we use this word communicator. A very important role for the government is to communicate what they're trying to do with the public, so that they're able to prima facie get some reaction from the public, and based on that response from public, they decide whether this policy can be implemented in the long term, whether there's acceptability of that policy. So that legitimizes the work that they do. That also showcases the kind of support, public support, that a particular policy has. And governments are always trying to test that. Now, that is not part of the workshop, but narrative building is a key role that governments also play. That is something that I would like everyone here to be mindful of. And the last one, Tanisha, change the slide, please. Yes, this is the most simplest one. This is basically looking at how firms in the sense corporations, institutions, companies are making commitments that are not enforced on them. So you will see an IKEA making a commitment of 1 billion to reduce greenhouse gas emission, 1 billion pounds by XYZ. Ola has a Mission Electric, which they are really focused on, and they have set up a proper center, an R&D center that they are focusing on. There are companies like Mahindra's and in the country who are trying to also enforce that. And a lot of that impetus on companies, while it's not happening in a legal and sort of a coercive manner, it is happening through agreements, through global pressure, through acceptability, through consumer awareness. So a consumer like me would want to spend money on an eco-friendly product versus a product that I know is polluting, right? So that in effect often translates into voluntary agreements coming from the companies. Brands are also often, as you know, are super image conscious. If eco-friendliness and if environment sustainability are trendy subjects that everybody's aware of, there is rising sort of impetus on your companies to enact these kind of agreements and to make those kind of promises. But often we have to be aware of how much of it is greenwashing, how much of it is just to sell a product versus how much of it is real commitment. So that level of scrutiny as people who are the public should have. And that's it. I have not been looking at chat, but I can look at it now. If there are any M&S and H&M are recycling clothes, yes. Any questions from anyone before we, next slide, Tanisha? Yeah.
Nikita had an interesting question.
I'm just going up.
Yeah.
Yes, we should. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that if we're talking about climate justice, then not everyone doesn't always have the opportunity to choose an eco-conscious product because it's often more expensive. So, like, isn't it time that we should shift the onus from individuals and consumers back onto corporations and back onto governments?
That is an excellent question, and that is a foundation. That is a very that was the thinking behind putting this workshop together. So we should change that. And why I also felt is that often when we are talking to young people, we are talking about lifestyle changes. Oh, you should go green. You should, which has its role, right? You should compost, you should use alternatives which are good, you should reduce your carbon footprint, use more public transport, things like that, have their lifestyle changes, attitude changes, have their role to play in that. You're practicing something, and when you practice it, you also start preaching it, you also start talking about it with your friends. But eventually the polluters on the planet are the big corporations, right? And those big corporations need to be made accountable. I also like the idea of how expensive these alternatives often are, right? And they are expensive because the government, the corporations know that they can sell them at that price, at that premium price. But when we think of the 90s, I don't know how many of you come from the 90s. There were a lot of these, the whole, our way of living, right, as Indians especially, was very close to nature. So I remember as a kid going to the market to buy milk in this small container. There was no plastic. We used to get Coke, Coca-Cola and all of that in glass bottles, right? So there are certain things we don't necessarily need, and it's for individuals to question that. Now, the idea is here because of how when in the 90s, when the country experienced that liberalization with free market coming in a big way and globalization, all those international products. And after 2012, we had Amazon, right? We didn't have home delivery till 2012. It's very recent. And with Amazon coming in, with Myntra, all of those, so many brands, I don't even know the name of half of them. There is a lot of carbon footprint that's increasing, and not just the packaging, that whole transport, the whole supply chain side, if you think about the logistics. And that's really the kind of thing we need to challenge. Because when we get into circular economy level of thinking, we know that there are solutions which are better than this. There are solutions which, the whole idea of repair, right, that used to exist in our country. It's a very Indian, jugaad is an Indian concept, where we are able to fix things very quickly. It's not the same as the Americans, right? That sort of stuff, that sort of circular thinking, which is very inherent to Indians as our nature, needs to make a comeback. I would say that, definitely. In addition to governments and corporations taking accountability. Carbon credit is a definitely very complex concept. I think in the last decade, the public has become, definitely, yes. Okay, so since we are on time, we have finished our first hour. I think I have addressed the main question. The rest seem to be comments. Gurpriya, let's definitely capture these somewhere. Let's move on. I want us to have 5 minutes. Thanks for the reminder, Tanisha. If you all want to take a washroom break, get some water, get a cup of tea, coffee, whatever it is that you'd like. Let's pause here for 5 minutes. Let's come back. And when we come back, we'll go right into the breakout rooms. I'm also going to set those breakout rooms. I don't know if Akbar is around, but we're going to just send you all into 5 breakout rooms where you would have a facilitator and you'll get right into activities. So please mute yourself. You can turn off your videos and go take a break, and we'll see you at 12:10 now. Hi. So I have assigned breakout rooms to each of you here. I just want to check for those who are around. Have you got the invite? Have you started to move into your rooms? Karan, are you able to move to the breakout room? Except for Tanisha.
Yeah, I am now.
Hi, everyone.
You shouldn't be here. Tanisha and I and Akbar are here.
It said I was invited to number 3.
Number 4.
But okay. 1 second. It's not letting me join the room. Okay, wait, let me try again.
Akbar is here also. I will give.
Akbar, can you get Karan in room 4?
Just 1 second. I can make Akbar host. Akbar, you're the host, so let me know if you can see it.
Sure. Yeah, I can see.
Is everyone in their room now? We only have Yashvi, Tanya still here. The rest should have moved into their rooms.
I think everyone has, except Tanisha and Asmita.
No, I'm here. Tanya and Yashvi, I can still see here. They should be in the rooms. Tanya, Yashvi, are you here? I think they need to come back and then they can go. I don't think they're back yet. They're in the, okay, now Tanya is gone. Yashvi has to go. So Yashvi is the only person remaining here.
She's in room number 5, no? Not joined. She needs to join.
Yeah, so once she comes back, I think she should go. Akbar, you have to time them. After 20 minutes, you have to close the room.
After 20 minutes, no?
Yeah. So it's 12:11 now. By 12:30, 31, bring them back. Yashvi, are you here? She has disappeared, it seems.
I think she's not here. She's not.
Okay.
Maybe Arpita, if it's just one person, you move to another room and support someone else in the group.
Yeah, the thing is, I will have to be made a co-host or something by Akbar.
Akbar, can you just make Arpita co-host?
Co-host or host. I don't know if he makes me host. Will the breakout room break? Like fall apart or what happens?
I can make you co-host or host. I'm making you a co-host.
We have Rahul.
Rahul has come back for some reason. Rahul, aren't you assigned in a room?
No, sorry, I just got back.
Got back from the room?
No. I just rejoined. We took a break, right?
Yeah, so Akbar, send Rahul to one of the rooms, please. Rahul and both Yashvi. Yashvi has not come back, it seems.
Yes.
Arpita, maybe you and me also, right? Like
No, we stay here.
Okay.
I'll have to be a host to sort of go in and out of rooms.
Okay, okay. I'll just hang you.
If you want to go, you can be assigned to a room.
Yeah, put me somewhere. How do I do that?
Akbar, you can assign Tanisha to one of the rooms.
Where it's got most number of participants or something, please.
Yeah.
In support with presentation and all.
Was
Still
this
here.
good? Were you able to understand everything?
Yeah, it was really nice. I learned a lot. I thought it was great. Let's fix this breakout rooms for the next one at least. Akbar, put me in another room now.
Send Tanisha to a breakout room.
3.
Has Akbar disappeared?
Sorry, sending 3. Anisha? Yeah.
Yashvi has still not come back. I don't know what to do about that.
I'm trying to move to some other room so that.
12:30, bring everybody back. I'm going to go step away for some time, but since it's not, my role is mostly over now.
Okay, you can.
Any reflections on the exercise? You could just unmute and speak. Rashmi saying really insightful. Anyone else? Please turn on your camera. It's nice to see you all. Brief and intensive is the idea. Okay, so I think we are almost back, except 4 more people. So I'm going to let them take their time. Thought-provoking things, that makes sense. That's lovely, Avanti. Great. All the women speaking so far. Any of the boys, any reflections? Please unmute and speak. I want to give people another minute to come back. Do we have all the 5 groups back? Do we have at least some people from the groups back? Or most people? What we'd like to do now is to give you all 2 to 3 minutes to share back the key highlights, the 4 questions that you have answered, any questions that you couldn't answer, and I can see it on the screen, so I can also read it. Could we start with group number 1, please? Abhas, is Abhas here?
I think Abbas is still in the breakout room, maybe.
No, I'm
Abbas
here. Just give me a second. Yeah. So
Abbas, sorry, I would like you to call out people from your group to speak, please.
Yeah. Tanmay or Sarah. Yeah, even Tanya. Anyone who's willing. Tanmay, you were active. Would you like to go?
Only 2 minutes, guys. You're losing your time. Tanmay, go ahead.
Okay.
Tanmay, you're on mute.
Okay, we have discussed various things in the policies regarding what are the stakeholders, how is it beneficial, and how it is giving various incentives government to various sectors, also to the scrap policy that we are not addressing. Right? That much I can say.
Can we go into the next slide, please, Tanisha? I'm just trying to read because I was not in any of the rooms. Okay. Anybody else from the group want to speak?
Probably Tanya or Sarah. Anyone wants to go?
I think the behavioral aspect of shifting to EV is the most important idea that you all have captured. Like while you have a policy which is trying to incentivize sectors, how do you ensure that there is uptake of those? Anybody else would like to add? Otherwise, we'll quickly move to the next group.
Yeah, Tanya has added on the chat.
Great. Okay, let's move on to the next group since we're running short of time. 3 Act amendments. Oh, seems like there are no answers here. Akash, your group?
Yeah, Rahul, since you didn't get a chance to speak during the session, do you want to summarize for us?
Yeah, no. So I think the main points was just how the policy is worded, and there are a lot of terms in there which are not defined. Even the ways in which the 2 bodies who decide on whether the trees are to be cut or replanted there's no clear understanding of how that process happens. It's just a vague timeline of how long you have to oppose it, or yeah, just come up with reasons why you think it shouldn't be cut. And it's just it's the whole thing is just really vague, and it's, I don't know, it seems to just benefit governments to just keep it bureaucratic like that and not get away with a lot of stuff that they keep hazy, like this, like what defines a heritage tree, or what it takes to even not even stop at just trees, but how do you transplant a full ecosystem from one place to another? None of that is taken into consideration.
Mm-hmm. And what does it mean, 200 cap arbitrary?
Yeah, so basically you need permission if you're cutting more than 200 trees from this body. And an ecosystem in a place like Bombay can even be 50 trees or 60 trees. I don't know why 200 is the number. And that seems like a lot.
Can we go to the next slide? Oh, is it over? Okay. Okay, let's go back. That sounds really good. I feel like you all were able to really look at the policy for what it was intending or aiming to do and understand the gaps.
Can I ask one
You
question?
don't have to call me ma'am.
Okay. Can I ask one question? Because heritage tree, they have defined that 50 years or more in the policy. So it is not a gap. It is a definite, there is an answer on that.
Anybody
It is
would want
50
to
years or
address
more.
that? It
But
is 50 years or more.
But does everyone agree that 15 years is the right thing to call it a heritage tree or not?
It is
Can I just?
arbitrary. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and also it's not mentioned in the amendment, right? So I think this is a design gap because you have to look through thousands of documents to even understand what is the definition. We don't know where to find it. So that's a design gap, if not, yeah.
But if you were designing a policy like this, first of all, would you design a policy like this? That's also a question to you all. And if you were, how would you frame this? How would you make the definitions clear?
I think the back end of the work, like before defining the policy, there should be an explanation on how you got to this point, like, you know, how you got to the number 200, how you got to this definition of 52 years and above. So like a small preamble or a small like introduction would be something that would be justified, so people understand that this was the work that was gone behind, you know, defining it like this is what I think.
Got it. I would not go into the details of a policy because that's for next time, but I feel like you all were able to look at the policy for what, not just for what it was intending to do, but how it has been framed, which is going a step further. So this is excellent. Thank you for sharing. Let's go to the next group.
Hi. Nikita, Alisha, if you guys want to sort of talk about some of the stuff we discussed.
Sure. Let's do it together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think initially we saw that the ban was only enforceable by local agencies, and it wasn't exactly a policy yet. It was just framed as a ban. So there was kind of a lack of accountability for the local agencies. So that was one thing. And anyone else want to jump in here?
Yes, please. Anyone from my group, please feel free to jump in with at any time with.
I made a point that the plastics alternatives were not told to people or were not mentioned in the policy, and people were not like it's written here that carrots and the stick So people were not told that if you collect plastic and give it to authorities, you will get this, you'll get that. So we always need to, tempt people on getting something to, so that we can gain benefit from them.
Yeah. There was also not a proper definition about what exactly is single-use plastic. So I think there was a lot of confusion as well with the ban. That was another thing. And yeah.
So you're looking at the plastic ban from 2018, right? Not now, just to be
No,
clear.
the one right now, right?
Is it the one which is happening now, like with the new waste management rules 2021, 2020?
18.
Sorry.
I'm so sorry. Was I too loud?
There's a lot of disturbance, but go ahead.
One second. Am I clear?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think there was not mention of e-waste, because e-waste also gives too much of plastic waste, which sometimes is not recyclable. So I think in 2018 e-waste was not there.
Yeah, so the 2018 ban, this specifically happened in Mumbai. It's not necessarily a policy. You can think of it as a test that I mentioned, like how governments test a particular thing. Maharashtra, even at that time, was one of the pioneers in the sense that no other mainstream city or state had tried it. No, none of the metropolitan, I mean. It had been tried in bits and pieces in parts of Himachal, the Northeast, and Kerala, so a little bit test here and there. I also like the fact how you've said clearly that the definition of single-use plastic was not clear, and that created the most important sort of confusion among the public because they didn't know what they could use, what they couldn't. And with the new rules that have come out last year, they have clearly defined the definition and what falls in the purview. So that's something I can definitely share, but I think you all have captured. The other point I think that is here is that plastic ban is trying to cause a ripple effect in how people consume and their behaviors. And it's literally like a stick on your head. What happens in the case of a ban, which is this sudden, and there is no alternative market that is existing, right? There are cloth bags, there are other jute bags maybe, but there is no standardization, there's no certification of those alternatives. There's no incentivizing of the economic market and of the alternatives. So people are basically asked to not do something without giving them a solution. Go ahead. So that would be another takeaway, but I like the point of like narrative building that you brought forth, and the incentives as well. So sorry, this is the next group, but thank you so much. Let's go to group number 4. Sorry, you're breaking, Karan.
Can you hear me now?
No.
No.
Can you switch off your video and then try? Karan, could you put your comment on the chat? Until then, we can request someone from group number 4 to share. Rashmi, Shanay, Smita, Vedika, would any of you would like to go and reflect on this?
So I can start and
go for
sorry.
it.
No, go ahead. Okay, so should I join in? I will start, but you can join in. So we discussed how the policy instruments used were, the economic and market-based policy, because we are talking about carbon credits and incentives, and how we also discussed sort of narrative building as a way of building accountability, because there was a tonality to the document about how they are sort of distributing the bulbs and things like that. So there is a tonality, but you need to be absolutely transparent to make sure that people know what's going on. And the issues that the policy is trying to address are, like maybe they're trying to build equity. It's a good step towards sustainability. We also discussed whether whether it's addressing anything about renewable energy, because it's still using electricity. So, but we sort of thought that maybe it's still a good way to be sustainable. And just the need to have better lighting and access to light. Sorry, Shana, I think you'll explain better. Please go ahead.
Next slide, Tanisha.
We also spoke about, since this is like a Gram Ujala Yojana, it's specifically for like rural districts, and who would be the stakeholders in making this kind of a policy a success, like village heads, district magistrates, local leaders within villages. We also discussed about how this may not necessarily be a success because so many rural households don't even have electricity to begin with. So they would not really be useful to have an LED. We also spoke about the dashboard that the government has, like displaying how many LED bulbs they've actually distributed, and then we discussed the credibility of such a dashboard, how many people would trust something like that, what could be increased or added to the website to actually increase credibility, like how they collected that information, who has submitted that kind of data, and then we also talked about if who like auditing that data, like so how would we verify that such data is actually correct? So media organizations and local district leaders actually cross-checking that data within their district and then what's on the website.
Yeah, and we sort of also discussed what happens post this initiative, right? Like, do the bulbs continue to be available to people at the same cost, or how do they go from there? Has there been anything discussed with them?
Right. Thank you. This is excellent. And I really like the fact that you've actually looked at the implementation aspects on ground, like the budgetary allocation or the access to information, and looking at it from the equity lens of whether it is translating into solving electrification issue with rural communities. But just to clarify, the Ujala scheme has enabled a lot of LED transition to happen and LED uptake to happen in the urban households. So some of you would remember between almost like the last 5-6 years, our bulbs, the usage of our bulbs has shifted from incandescent bulbs to the LED bulbs quite a lot. And that was majorly because the markets of LED bulbs was incentivized by the government. Subsidies were provided. There was a narrative campaign. Then LED bulbs, the cost of each LED, the fact was that the cost of each LED bulb was much lower than before. And therefore, it is touted as one of the success stories, at least in the urban side. And now the government is trying to take it to the rural sector, which is great. But I really like that aspect of equity coming in and narrative also that you have captured so well. Thank you. Let's move to the Abbas is giving us more ideas here. Let's go to the next one.
Thanks, Arpita. Would Priyanka, Kaustubh, Yashvi like to share from group number 5?
Sure. So the policy, the regulation that we were discussing was the Kusum scheme, and for this, it was basically around shifting from diesel pumps for farmers, basically to shift from diesel agricultural pumps to solarized agricultural pumps. So the main reason for this is, of course, to shift to green energy and make the whole make this sustainable. and also to ensure like that farmers have access to water. And at the same time, because farmers would be using this green energy, they would basically benefit by also being able to like sell, I think, carbon credits, or basically like earn an additional income by using the solarized pumps. So that also gives them a little bit of financial security. So that was like the main aspect of the Kusum scheme. Would anybody else like to go ahead from my group to discuss further? Okay, so I'll just continue. The policy instruments that we were discussing were, so one was that this is more of like an incentive which is being given to farmers. But also one thing that we found was that we didn't understand why farmers would want to necessarily like take this up and switch, because it wasn't very clear what the major incentive for farmers would be. Like, of course, they said that farmers will get financial security, but there was no discussion on how much financial security would farmers get. Does it actually make sense for them to take part in this scheme and give them like enough benefit from it? Another thing that we were discussing was that the infrastructure costs for this project are very, very high. Also, like, this was just that a point that I was just thinking of right now was that there is no sort of like pilot which is done for such projects, and this is like a very infrastructure heavy project. You don't even know the kind of maintenance costs that it will incur maybe 3, 4, 5 years later. So when you think about it from a grand scale, I feel like it's a lot of investment without even like running a pilot and seeing how much benefit we're actually like getting from shifting to solarized pumps, especially because it's around like 30,000 CR worth of investment. Anybody else from my group wants to like
mention? Sarah, go ahead.
I'm not in the group, but I have read about this before. And I think one problem with the implementation of this solar water pump scheme is that while it has immense potential to boost agricultural growth while curbing the need to lay rural electric networks, the adoption of practices that work efficiently in the west-south corridor may not be used to eastern India, which is the Ganga-Brahmaputra basin. And that is because higher number of solar hotspots and peak sunlight hours hit the west-south corridor, unlike eastern India, and that can make solar power generation more expensive for people in that corridor. And also for small and marginal farmers in the Ganga-Brahmaputra corridor, the cost of installing these pumps will be basically unaffordable, and they will be not getting as much back from it as they will put in installing it. And so there are also studies done on this which indicate, I think there was this one study from 2015 which indicated that there is an absence of resolution on how many wells will be installed with solar power that are connected back to the grid. So there is a little ambiguity here. So it might not be as viable as it is presented as of now.
Absolutely, and thank you for adding those points. So lot of thoughts actually. The infrastructure point is a very important one, and I'm glad that has been brought up. How the policy is laid down, the idea is that currently farmers are given heavily subsidized electricity, which in addition to, now where is that the subsidized electricity coming from? One, the discoms in this country are at a huge loss. So government earlier this year has also announced massive spending for the discoms, but a lot of that is also being distributed in terms of cost that is coming to urban users like us. We are paying a slightly higher cost. So there is that stakeholder. I don't see stakeholders written, but there's that stakeholder piece as well. And for farmers, in principle, at least in theory, what this policy is trying to do is, okay, you have access to your own decentralized solar production, right? Electricity production, which is sustainable. Of course, it reduces emissions. By providing solar pumps, the idea is also to incentivize farmers from using too much water. Because what they used to do by conventional electricity is they know that electricity to them is coming for a certain number of hours, right? And they will just leave their water sets on. So that caused a lot of water loss as well. So by doing that, by moving to solar, one, they'll have their own electricity that they can give back to the grid. And like Sarah was pointing out, of course, that has its own challenges because information gaps exist, which are massive, as well as the practical feasibility based on different parts of the country you're in. And overall, there is about 40,000 odd crores of, I think, investment coming in, which is divided between center and states, 40% coming from center and the rest coming from the states. That itself also has challenges because you have to look at the feasibility of that kind of capital being invested from the state as well as center's point of view. You have to look at how you're building awareness, how you're building engagement, taking feedback from farmers, and the infrastructure here. So I'm glad that all of those points got covered. Thank you everyone for doing such a fabulous job. This is much better than we had anticipated because this was a test for us to see how this group takes it. We have run out of time, we're over time, but I'm going to just take another 5 minutes to quickly wind this conversation for today up so that you have clear idea about what's coming up next. Since I don't think we have time, but if you do have some ideas, okay, this is going a little bit too much. Going forward, I wanted to narrow our focus and talk about Mumbai a little bit. If you go to the last few slides, Anisha, the first slide talks about, just go back. Yeah, back. The first slide after this. Next one. Next one. Okay, I think we are missing one slide. There is a slide before this. Essentially the point being that what we are trying to share is that there are a lot of, maybe I can share screen. There are a lot of climate impact that the city sees. And just in the last few months, the city has encountered a lot of these challenges, and I've just tried to capture it just to give you a snapshot of what city we are looking at this moment. Of course, this is the monsoon season, so the erraticity of rainfall is not going to be a surprise to all of you, but just the gravity of impact that the city is having and the kind of discourse that the city needs to have in terms of providing equity, in terms of safety and disaster preparedness, which is what we've talked about as the adaptation level strategies, as well as mitigation, ensuring that the emissions per capita that the city has are lowered, the way the city is structured and the preparedness around with the stormwater system, drainage systems, all of that is important for us to think about as Mumbaikas, because the facts, the data in terms of science with the new IPCC report in addition is very, very clear. Mumbai is at risk of the submergence by 2050. We know of that very clearly. But there's also hope. The city with the new government is trying to definitely push forward the climate agenda in a big way, and it is doing it across different global and national and state levels. Mumbai joined the C40 city network late last year. Mumbai recently announced the EV policy that some of you have looked at just now. Mumbai is also planning to release its climate action plan by October, and there is an event planned with the minister where he'll be come and talk about that, the action plan and what it entails. And I think we all can also send you invites for that because it's supported by our partner work. Mumbai is announcing another mangrove area, the Thane Creek Flamingo Sanctuary, as a Ramsar site, which is going to be only its second Ramsar site after the Lonar Lake in the state. So a lot of exciting things, a lot of stuff is happening. It is coming in a big way. It is emerging as a big leader, at least in the country, on climate action. And for us as young people, for us as citizens, therefore, it is important to participate in what is happening. And it's important to look at policies, not just for, the kind of narrative and the kind of big sort of claims that the policies are making, but also look at them holistically to understand the gaps and being able to point out those gaps at the right time. So there are certain ways that citizens can participate in the policy making process. Some of it we'll start introducing you in the next workshop. There's going to be a lot of content that comes your way before the next workshop, which we'd like you to go over. Because as you can imagine, something like this cannot be delivered over 2 workshops. In 4 hours, even if we try, we cannot equip you with all the tools. But our effort is to provide you enough content that you can utilize and also share with your your networks. And in terms of the next steps, I've already sort of shared. There is a workshop planned which will look at one specific policy and try to look at what are the gaps that policy has, who are the stakeholders, and this would be led by an expert. So not just a 30-minute exercise, but a 2-hour exercise almost, or at least a 1-hour exercise where you get to listen to experts and you'll get to deep dive into the different aspects of that particular policy. And this is going to be a state-specific policy, which is going to be applied to Mumbai and therefore is very relevant to all of you as Mumbaikars. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. There is a feedback form that we have that Gurpreet, I'd like you to post in the chat box. If the more number of you who take up that feedback form, the better for us, because this is only the first cohort of this workshop series. We have at least 3 more cohorts that we will be doing the same workshop with in the next 3 Saturdays. We have had over 102 people who have signed up already. And yeah, so please drop your feedbacks. Definitely drop your feedback if you'd like to attend the next workshop. It's going to be more intense, but definitely more exciting as well. And any other inputs that you have, any other ideas that you have for the organizers, please, you can also feel free to email us. And thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for spending your time here. The link is not working, Gurpreet. You'll probably need to give access. Please stay. You all can try again. And for those of you who have questions for us as organizers, you can stay back. I'm still here another 5-6 minutes. But we're done for the day. Thank you. Anybody from the facilitator side want to say anything? Please go ahead.
Thank you, and I hope that we can all continue this in the next session, and all feedback is highly appreciated. Thank you.
Karan, we still can't hear you very well. Maybe you can just type it in the chat box again.
And Akash, do you want to speak about the Global Shapers Mumbai network?
Yeah, so I don't know if any of you or how many of you have heard about the Global Shapers, but we're basically a community of youth from Mumbai. We're a part of the World Economic Forum. It's sort of like a youth chapter. And Karan, Andre, and myself, among the facilitators, are from the Global Shapers. And we do a lot of projects in Mumbai for social upliftment and climate action. And if any of you are interested in learning more, please feel free to reach out to me or Karan or Andre. You can check us out on Instagram, on the website, or on the World Economic Forum website.
Thank you so much, Akash. And Karan, I hope you'll be able to speak to the audience next time, because there's so much to learn from Karan as well as the rest of the facilitators. Thank you again. I hope some of you have at least filled the feedback form. We'll write back to you. Definitely try to attend the next workshop. It's going to be more exciting. But really grateful for you to taking time on a Saturday. We look forward to seeing you, and please send any emails that you would like us to address in terms of questions or ideas. Anything is good for us. Thank you. I'm going to end this meeting now.